The legacy of Christopher Columbus is complex. Throughout North and South America, heroic tales of adventure and courage have slowly given way to recognition of the vast injustices endured by indigenous Americans. Statues have been taken down, myths dispelled. And now, amid the controversy and conflict, new stories emerge. Columbus, who remains a national hero to many, is accused of instituting the Atlantic slave trade, of launching an active genocide against the native peoples of the Caribbean, literally the murderer of millions. What is the truth? What did Columbus actually do? The world which Christopher Columbus inhabited was hard, often brutal, intensely religious and very weird. Stories of giants, of Amazons, cannibals and griffins, strange beasts in strange, unknown lands. These were as real and believable as the earth and sky. Mythical beasts, magic and the devil sat easily alongside other, more notorious facts of 15th century European life. Alongside slavery and the Inquisition, commerce and religion. Columbus, a Genoese merchant and sailor, was witness to both Portugal and Spain emerging as rivals for control of the Iberian Peninsula, trade within the Mediterranean, and beyond, access to the vast riches of the East. As to the latter, this rivalry was complicated by the infidel Ottoman and Islamic empires, which had prohibited Christian access to the prime trading routes to China and India, and just as importantly, Jerusalem. The obvious solution, of course, was just as the Portuguese had done, sail directly around Africa and bypass the Ottomans altogether. Not only did this indeed prove most profitable, it was also the most practical. As everyone in both royal courts of Lisbon and Castile knew, sailing west beyond the slaving colonies of the Canaries and the Azores was literally suicide. The ocean was simply too big. Yet by the 1490s, Columbus was desperate. Desperate for gold, for recognition, for money, and most especially for titles. He possessed a true genius for seamanship and for self-deception, in which he was able to convince himself that not only was the Atlantic Ocean much narrower than others calculated, but that the Asian continent stretched further east than otherwise thought. They didn't laugh when he told them the Earth was round. They laughed because he was simply plain wrong. Predictably, his request for funds to sail west was rejected in Lisbon, but the Spanish monarchs in Castile relented. Perhaps it was the need to compete with rivals Portugal, or simply the promise of trade with the Indies. Indeed, Ferdinand was especially drawn to the idea, solving as it did that second problem imposed by the Ottoman Empire. He needed money to fund his proposed crusade to the Holy Land, convinced as he was that his domain over Jerusalem would bring about the second coming of Christ and the apocalypse. So, in August 1492, Columbus, now promised the grandiose title of Admiral of the Ocean Seas, set sail in 3 small ships into the vast Atlantic. Regardless of what was to transpire, this was clearly a monumental event. There is little doubt that Columbus possessed extremes of physical and mental courage, as did those with whom he sailed. After 4 long weeks, provisions running low, false hope and a near mutiny, no land, no birds, alone in the vast ocean, the expedition at last found land. Over the course of 4 voyages to the Caribbean, Columbus sought to impose a personal dictatorship over the main colony he founded in Hispaniola, what is now the island of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. In sharp contrast to the model of Spanish conquest developed during the Reconquista of Muslim Granada, Columbus insisted that European settlers worked to his personal benefit as salaried employees, with little to no economic or political freedom. He imposed a tribute system upon the native population, in which individuals were responsible for providing quotas of gold, cotton or labour. Once paid, a token was provided to wear around one's neck. Failed to satisfy Columbus's demands, and the tribes were effectively worked to death. To bolster this hostage workforce, Columbus, of course, captured slaves. He began this practice immediately upon arrival in this new world, sending an initial group of 7 back to Spain from his first voyage, most of them dying soon after arrival. Men, women and children, ripped away from their families and forced to work as servants in Columbus's gold mines, or else sent back to Europe, reportedly in the thousands. Columbus used several means to justify this practice. As non-Christians, the Indians were, of course, living in a state of sin. When displaying any hint of resistance to European presence in their homeland, the natives were enslaved by right of conquest, and Columbus also accused them of cannibalism. Reporting on the savagery of the island's inhabitants, we hear stories of human bones in cooking pots, legs being roasted on open spits, even one tribe's practice of capturing their enemies' children, and, like livestock, raising them to adulthood to then be consumed. Columbus and his cohort were also quick to point out the fact that the natives themselves had slaves. Although of course not completely unheard of amongst the Native American societies of this period, the Aztecs and Maya of Mexico themselves practiced slavery, a ritual form of cannibalism and human sacrifice. Most historians believe that while several of the Caribbean tribes did indeed have slaves, stories of cannibalism were either massively exaggerated, if not outright fabricated. In truth, Columbus's approach was simple: comply and be free to provide his administration with exorbitant tribute, or else resist and be accused of cannibalism, and then enslaved. In this way, the island saw repeat acts of savagery on the part of Columbus and his cadre of conquistadors. Bands of Europeans marauding across the island, raiding native villages and towns, enslaving and wantonly raping as they went. One notorious case was actually documented by a close friend of Columbus, Michel de Cunha, who had been given a particularly beautiful enslaved native woman as a gift by Columbus. Bizarrely, the girl did not want to be raped, and so had to be repeatedly beat until, as Cunha states, "We came to such terms that you would have thought that she'd been brought up in a school of whores." Such was the regime that Columbus established. Question or rebel against his leadership as many did, and the punishments were severe. Many had their ears and noses cut off, some were hanged. A woman who questioned Columbus's lowly birth was stripped naked and had her tongue cut out by Columbus's brother. The admiral later congratulated Bartholomew on his just defense of their family's honor. Estimates of the population of pre-Columbian Hispaniola vary from around 100,000 to a few million. The lower figure is more likely. By 1510, around 35,000 were left, the majority dying from disease, mainly smallpox. although most would deny that Columbus participated in an active genocide of the native population of the Caribbean. In truth, although he seems to have considered them something close to soulless subhumans, he nevertheless wanted to keep them alive to work in his gold mines, or to sell in the slave markets of Seville. It is clear that the conditions he created and the murders he committed contributed significantly to the near total annihilation of the entire population. There are those who might be tempted to forgive Columbus these crimes, particularly with reference to the realities of late medieval life. Indeed, at the same time as Columbus was instituting his savage reign in the Caribbean, the French were laying waste to northern Italy in pursuit of their claim to the crown of Naples, committing acts every bit as barbaric. Yet Columbus is surely condemned regardless. Many of his contemporaries certainly thought so. Several of those who sailed with Columbus, some counting themselves his friends, complained of his brutal behaviour. There were those who mutinied against his rule, offended both by his executions of fellow Spaniards and his treatment of the native populations. Most notably, he was repeatedly criticised by Queen Isabella back in Spain. She time and again requested that, quote, her Indians be treated with care and respect, requests ignored by Columbus in favour of a policy of rape, murder, and enslavement. Eventually, in 1500, the Spanish court sent Chief Justice Francisco de Bombadilla to Hispaniola to investigate the mounting evidence of barbarism. And Bombadilla, horrified by the realities of the Italians' rule in the Caribbean. By this time, it seems Columbus was resembling something close to Marlon Brando in Apocalypse Now. Duly arrests Columbus and his brothers and sends them home in chains. From here on out, it seems the great admiral commits himself to something of a mental and physical collapse. In the past, when called upon to defend his actions, he had taken to growing out a large beard and dressing as a friar. On this occasion, he proceeds to pen a long and ridiculous letter to the Spanish court, comparing himself to the biblical Abraham and to Moses. He also writes a letter to the Pope, claiming he had found the Garden of Eden. He had, in fact, found Venezuela. It is also around this time that he starts to call himself Christ-bearer. Back in Hispaniola, Bombadilla sets about freeing the enslaved population and ending the looting and kidnapping of the natives. Whilst in Spain, Columbus is eventually freed from captivity and, bizarrely, given permission for one last voyage of the New World, although he is prohibited to visit Hispaniola. Thus, between May 1502 and November 1504, he took a few ships to explore the islands of the southern Caribbean in an attempt to find a strait to India. This was a particularly sore point for Columbus. In the past, he had even resorted to having his comrades sign a contract, agreeing that in past voyages he had landed in China. Penalty for going against this agreement was a large fine and, naturally, having your tongue cut out. This was also the trip where he spent prolonged periods sat alone in the crow's nest of his ship, talking to God. Yet, despite this, his final voyage ultimately ended in disaster. His crew ended up shipwrecked in Jamaica, ultimately to be rescued by the new governor of Hispaniola, who genuinely despised Columbus and had him swiftly sent back to Europe. He was never to return. He died 2 years later, embittered and angry, in May 1506. Thanks for listening. If you like this, subscribe and hit the notification bell.